Hello, in this video I'm going to share 7 tips for the FAA instrument check ride based on my own experience. I took my check ride this year in July over at Ocean County Airport here in New Jersey, and I thought I'd share some things I learned from my experience. So my first tip is to treat the check ride like an actual IFR flight. This is a pretty general piece of advice, but there's 2 things in particular that I'd like to point out. One is that FAR 62147 makes it clear that unless there is an explicit prior arrangement, the examiner is not the pilot in command for a practical test. So that basically means that you, the applicant, are going to most likely be the PIC, and therefore you will have all the responsibilities associated with being PIC. So you have to be prepared to show that you are ready to be a PIC under instrument flight rules, and so it's a very good reason to treat your check ride like an actual IFR flight with all the responsibilities that you will have once you're an instrument rated pilot. The second thing that comes directly from treating the check ride like an actual IFR flight is to not do things differently or to do anything extra that you would not normally do for an IFR flight. The second piece of advice I have for treating your check ride like an actual IFR flight is on the day of your check ride, you should not try to do things differently or do anything extra that you wouldn't normally do. I feel like not only could doing something new throw you off and raise your anxiety, might also make it obvious to the examiner that you're doing something just because he or she is there, and you don't want them to start questioning if you're doing things just to put on a show for them. What you want to show is that you're a truly responsible pilot with thorough safety habits that you're not just going to have on the day of your check ride, but rather that you're going to continue once you have your rating. My second piece of advice is to build good habits for a long time before your check ride. This is closely related to what I said before about not doing anything new on the day of your check ride. I think it's essential to have your routine down before the check ride for some time so that it's smooth and refined. So what this means is that you shouldn't start doing things like checklist usage or positive exchange of flight controls on the day of your test. These 2 things are very important to the FAA, and starting to do them on the day of your test is not going to cut it. I know myself, I was guilty as a student pilot of, I would certainly use the checklists that I had on the ground for before takeoff and that sort of thing, but once I was in the air, the checklist would basically not come out again until after landing. So it's important to start practicing doing a climb checklist, doing a cruise checklist, doing a landing checklist or an approach checklist. For the landing check, in a simple airplane like a 172, just doing a GUMPS check might be enough. But the point is that you don't want to start doing checks just on the day of the check ride, because it will clearly be unnatural to you and will probably expose the fact that it's not something that you do normally and that you will not do once you're actually instrument rated. In addition to doing things like checklist usage or positive exchange of flight controls, my controls, your controls, my controls, or vice versa, I think it's also important to do little things that are not specific to instrument flying, that are just a part of good airmanship. An example of that would be holding flight controls correctly when you're taxiing to account for the wind. The way I remember it is, if the wind's in my face, climb into it with the yoke. If it's behind me, dive away. It's relatively simple once you get in the habit of doing it, but if it's not something that you're used to doing, it'll take an extra second, and again, it'll be clear that it's not something that you do normally. I think another good habit to build is traffic awareness. If you're visual, as in not under the hood, at a minimum, it's a good idea to look where you're going before you turn. So a quick glance to the left if you're turning left, a quick glance to the right if you're turning right at the least, and in a high wing you might even need to lift the wing a bit in order to get a good look. But doing this is going to be a sign that you're thinking about your surroundings. If you're under the hood, I would do this with my CFII when we were preparing for the check ride, and I, of course, did it on the day of the test as well. Ask if the direction that you're turning is clear before blindly turning in that direction. I think doing so shows that you're not just thinking about the tasks that you have inside the airplane, but rather you're thinking about where you are in space in relation to other airplanes and perhaps even terrain. So when you ask if it's clear before you turn, it shows that you're thinking more generally and that you're aware of your surroundings, and again is a good sign for being a responsible pilot. My third tip is to plan your cross-country thoroughly. You'll most likely receive an assignment for a fictitious cross-country flight from your examiner before the check ride. It could be the night before or a few days before, but you'll be expected to arrive at your check ride with a flight plan and completed weight and balance in hand. You're probably only going to fly the first leg or two of that fictitious cross-country of the flight that you planned, but you should still treat it as if the cross-country is going to happen. You should plan as if you will actually be completing the whole flight as planned, even though that's not going to be the case. So things to keep in mind while planning: even though it's IFR, you should still be aware of special use airspace and planning your route. If your flight plan takes you through special use airspace, be prepared to explain what you would do in the event that ATC does not clear you through the airspace. So that means considering things like, how much would having to take a longer route cut into my fuel reserves? Does having to go around the airspace affect my fuel planning significantly? And does that mean that I have to rethink my alternatives? I think it's important to think about things like that beforehand so that you're not caught off guard during your oral. Another thing to think about with planning is whether or not your altitude choices are legal, but also are they safe? The MEA for an airway might only be 2,000 feet MSL, but if there is an extended part of that leg over water, you have to think, is it a good idea to be at 2,000 feet over water in a single engine airplane? Personally, I try to choose an altitude where I would have adequate glide range to reach land from the very middle of the body of water if I lost my engine there. So just something to consider. If you're going to be crossing 10 miles of water, do you want to be doing that at 2,000 feet? Might be legal to do so, but might not necessarily be a good idea. And sometimes risk is unavoidable, but try to minimize it as much as possible. Another part of your cross-country planning that you should be prepared to discuss is approaches, specifically which approach you're planning to use at the destination airport. Then also be prepared to talk about, if you can't get that approach, what other approaches might you be expected to fly, and would you be able to fly them? I think it's a good idea to take a look at all the relevant approach plates for the airport beforehand, just to make sure that there aren't any unfamiliar symbols or confusing procedures that could trip you up when you're asked about it during the oral. Again, preparation beforehand can save you a lot of sweat during the test. Finally, something that I learned from my cross-country assignment was to consider if there's any special requirements for flying into the destination airport. So I was assigned a cross-country to Washington Dulles International, which is within the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area, the SFRA. And flying into the SFRA requires you to complete a separate special course, which you can take online through the FAA safety page. It's linked to the Wings program. You'll actually get half a credit for wings if you complete the course. But that was just a little thing that I picked up when I was planning the flight. So when the day of the test came, I brought my course completion certificate as part of the folder of things that I brought to the test, and was ready to show that to the examiner. And it's little things like that, just showing that you've dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's, that really show that you're detail-oriented and prepared to be an instrument pilot. Tip number 4 is be prepared to demonstrate a full pre-flight. You might not necessarily have to, especially if the examiner knows that you just flew the airplane from somewhere else to the airport where you're taking your test. But at the very least, you're probably still going to have to show that you can determine whether the aircraft is airworthy for flight under IFR or not. And the biggest difference between a VFR pre-flight and an IFR pre-flight is going to be the instruments for instrument flight rules. And it's one thing to memorize acronyms like a tomato flames for required day VFR equipment, or grab card, which is instrument equipment, but you must be able to also apply the knowledge that's contained in those acronyms in order to make a competent decision. He's probably not going to ask, what does grab card stand for? But you might be asked, your turn coordinator's not working. Can you fly IFR? And you should be able to answer based on the acronym, no, you can't, because the R in card is rate of turn indicator, so it's required equipment for IFR. And then another consideration with instruments is an operative equipment properly marked as so? Another thing you should be prepared to do is to identify the antennas on the exterior of the airplane. My examiner actually did ask me specifically when we got to the airplane, what's this antenna? What's that antenna? And he was impressed that I was able to identify each of them. That's something that an instructor can be very helpful for, because sometimes, especially with older airplanes, equipment gets removed, and sometimes an antenna is just a remnant from the past and doesn't have a function anymore. But it's good to know that and be able to tell the examiner, and also be able to point out which antennas are important, like a glide slope or a comm antenna. So you might not necessarily be asked that, but it's something that you would be better off being prepared to answer. My 5th tip for the Checkride is to be ready to fly approaches under a variety of conditions. So examples would be all equipment is available, all resources are available to you, or stipulations like no GPS allowed, or flying to different minimums. In the case of my Checkride, the 3rd approach, I was told to do an RNAV GPS approach into runway 6 at Ocean County Airport. The approach does have an LPV available, but I was told to fly the approach as an LNAV instead. So I had to be more careful about additional minimum altitudes that I wouldn't have to worry about for the LPV. So there's a fix called Zoker that's a few miles out that you have to cross at 720 that you don't have to worry about on the LPV. And then also the MDA for the LNAV is 520 as opposed to the minimums for LPV, which is 330. And that's something that you want to catch, and you don't want to bust minimums on your Checkride because one, it's unsafe if you did that in real life, and 2, that will probably be something that results in failing the Checkride if you do it. Tip number 6 is don't scare your examiner. To put it simply, don't do anything crazy, reckless, or unsafe, and make sure that you're in control of the airplane at all times. If the examiner has to take the controls from you because they feel imperiled, you probably will not be walking away with an instrument rating. The ACS specifically lists any action or lack of action by the applicant that requires corrective intervention by the evaluator to maintain safe flight as an item that can be grounds for disqualification. So just make sure that you don't put yourself in a situation where the examiner has to take over. It certainly does not bode well for them trusting you to be a safe instrument pilot after the check ride if they have to step in to save you from yourself, basically, during the check ride. To the contrary, I think it's important to do the opposite of scaring the examiner, which is to make them feel comfortable. So that could mean talking out loud as you're flying so that the examiner knows your thought process. Say, for example, you're about to fly a course reversal on an approach. You might want to say out loud what kind of an entry you're going to be doing and how you're going to execute it. So that could be a 30-degree turn to do a teardrop entry, or immediately turning for the outbound leg if you're doing a direct entry. Just say out loud what you're doing so that it's not a surprise. And as an added bonus, too, it gives them less of an excuse to distract you with questions if you're already explaining to them what you're doing. And not just them, if you made a mistake in your thought process in planning the turn, you might actually be able to catch it when you say it out loud. And then you have a chance to correct it, to correct yourself and fly the entry correctly and save your check ride. My last tip, number 7, is just to relax. The examiner does not want you to fail. They don't want to fail you. So if you just show the examiner that you're a qualified, safe instrument pilot, you most likely will pass. The tolerances are actually pretty generous if you think about it. Even half scale deflection on an approach, I would say, is a pretty big deal, but you're allowed 3/4 scale deflection. So obviously you should still try to fly as precisely as possible, but it should be a comfort to know that you do have some room to work with. Another comforting thing to keep in mind is that the ACS does give examiners some room for discretion in applying the standards of the test. So specifically, there's a section in the ACS which helps to define unsatisfactory performance, and two of the things listed are consistently exceeding tolerances stated in the skill elements of the task, or failure to take prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded. So I think what this is saying is that your Checkride nerves might cause you to temporarily go outside the normal tolerances for an altitude, but provided you acknowledge the problem and respond to it quickly, this probably will not result in failing the check ride. An exception to this might be going 100 feet below minimums, which would be unsafe. But if at one moment, say you're flying an approach and you find yourself at 2150 when you should be at 2000, it's probably not going to be the end of the world as long as you recognize the deviation and correct it promptly. And keep in mind that the examiner has to tell you the moment you do something that they have to fail you for. So if they don't say anything, it's best to just keep going. Again, that just goes back to treating the check ride like a real world IFR flight. Little mistakes can and do happen, but the most important thing is to not stop flying the airplane. And finally, if you fail, you fail, and it's not the end of the world. You may or may not have to pay full price for a second check ride, but again, it is what it is. My examiner said that he doesn't charge full price for a second check ride, or for a retest, but that's a bridge that you can cross when you come to it. The examiner will most likely remind you before your flight that you cannot redo any test that you failed. So busting an altitude once might be forgiven, but if you make a bigger mistake that they can't overlook, then, things happen. But if you do mess up on something, keep in mind that you still do have the option to complete all the other tasks. remaining on the test, so that you might only have to come back and repeat 1 or 2 things on your retest. So it might actually be good too. You might benefit from having the pressure come off, knowing that you won't be getting your instrument rating that day, but you can do the rest of the test with the heat off, and whatever you do is going to be something that you're not going to have to do on the retest.